Well, what our research that is on, for example, the front page of the Telegraph shows this morning is that, as you said, the civil service has grown significantly larger. We've seen a 25% increase in the total number of civil servants. It's becoming more expensive. We've seen a 60% increase in the total salary bill, and it's becoming far, far more focused on things like social research, economics and policy, and not on operational roles, which are the frontline delivery services. So what we're seeing is a civil service that is increasingly out of step with the priorities of both voters and taxpayers.
And totally against the promises made by Boris Johnson, who wanted to cut the number of those in the civil service by 91,000. We've gone the opposite way.
Absolutely. And, we've heard this very dominant narrative that the civil service increase has been driven by, for example, Brexit, which did require an increase in the number of trade officials, for example, or COVID, which, of course, required an increased number of bureaucrats to deal with the many COVID emergency schemes. But unfortunately, since the end of COVID, we've seen civil service numbers continue to increase, not decrease, which is what we would have expected. So we're seeing a civil service that simply cannot get to grips with numbers.
It's getting too fat, Amy.
I can't get my head around these stories, because these stories focus on numbers. They don't focus on efficiency and productivity and what is actually happening within the civil service. They just solely focus on numbers. If you look at it this way, if I have a pound coin and then have lots of pound coins, they get more valuable, right? So if we look at the civil service bill, it costs the taxpayer $15 billion a year. However, when you cut that number, you still need those people. So generally they're replaced with a much more expensive agency staff. The bill for that last year was an additional $3 billion. So you're not trimming fat, you're cutting corners, and then you're having to make up for it with taxpayers' money.
Yeah, but that would be an understandable argument if you were talking about frontline staff, say people in the Home Office to deal with the migration issue. But if you're talking managerials and 100 grand plus style people...
But when you look at something like the NHS and a comparative private industry, the management levels are lower. The more staff you have, the more management you need, obviously, to run the business efficiently. And, Elliot, you talk about taxpayers' money, wasting taxpayers' money. Can we talk about the 140 million to the Rwandan government? There is yet to be a flight to the Rwandan government. Can we talk about the 120 million spent on the Festival of Brexit, attended by about 200 people? Can we talk about 39 billion on test and trace? This is where the government is wasting the audience's money. It's not on the civil service. The civil service need to be valued, and they need to be celebrated as the valuable public sector workers that they are. And talk like this devalues them completely.
I think, listen, all three of those schemes that you mentioned, Amy, all have significant issues that have been well addressed and that we've spoken about in detail. But I think ultimately they're, relatively short-term flash-in-the-pan problems. What we're seeing with the increase in the size of the civil service is we're seeing a state that is starting to dominate people's lives more and more and more, and getting involved in the way people live. And ultimately, what we're seeing is every single time there's a new emergency, every time there's a new problem, we need to bring in more civil servants to deal with this short-term issue, but then suddenly the civil servants stay. Talking about agency staff are not needed for example, as I said, the social research, the economic roles that you're seeing predominate now in the civil service.
I've got one example.
It's not operational roles.
So one example is in 2017, there was one of these big rounds where the government liked to say, it's not us, it's migrants, it's not us, it's just stop oil, it's not us, it's Labour, it's not us, it's the civil service. So they trimmed down the civil service in 2017, and they took a lot out of the healthcare sector. And one of those jobs was to do with infectious diseases. It had one of these fluffy names like public health management or something like that, but they were actually really, really crucial. What happened in 2022 was the pandemic. We needed those people in those positions, and because we didn't have them, it contributed to a lack of preparedness, and I think we needed the people in position.
Yeah, but the civil service isn't meant to be an insurance policy like that, is it? Who knew we had a pandemic on the way?
Well,
we certainly
would have had a far better idea if we'd had the support in position in government. I see the civil service as the body, and if you pump it full of poison, which this current government is doing, it's not going to function correctly. But it's essentially the skeleton of government, and you need that. And they're the experts in the field that say things like, hang on a minute, I don't think Brexit's practical. Maybe we should do it this way. They're the people that are there throughout, not the ministers that come and go. They're the experts in the field. The ministers are there to take what they're saying on to be as productive in their departments. And that's why I think this whole talk of snowflakey, work shy, it just pushes morale down so much. And that's why at the moment, only a quarter of civil servants feel valued, they feel paid correctly.
So
and
I think-
actually,
so
most of them are looking for another job.
So the poor little things are under stress, Elliot.
The problem with this idea that they're pumping poison into the civil service is not true. They're pumping money into the civil service. What we've seen is an increase in the median pay of a civil servant by about 26%. That's because the number of civil servants at the very, very top, between £75,000 and £200,000, has almost tripled. So we're not seeing a situation in which the civil service is being treated poorly. We're seeing a situation in which the civil service are having more and more money pumped into it every single year.
Why have
given perks that the private sector can only dream of, pension packets the private sector can only dream of, pretty generous work from home allowances. We're not seeing poison being pumped into civil service. It's money that's being
There's
pumped.
essentially been an ideological war waged against the civil service for the past 10 years.
And yes, it's increased in
and there
size.
is a real terms pay cut over the last 10 years, and they aren't being you cherry pick some of the highest paid civil servants, which is about 2,000 of a workforce of
It's costing 15 billion.
Well, the median pay is
well, then what
26%.
they've been on strike continually throughout the year because of the pay, which isn't adequate.
Well, the median pay of the civil servants, that's the average civil servant, has gone up by more than the basic state pension since 2016. The total salary bill has increased far ahead of GDP. It's below inflation if you look at the individual pay bands, but what we're seeing is that civil servants are being moved up the pay bands. So rather than increasing the individual pay bands, civil servants are simply being shuffled up the ladder, and that's moving them away from operational frontline roles, the things that taxpayers actually really care about, and towards woolly things like that.
OK, we've got to leave it there, I'm afraid.